How's that? Thank you. So 2 years on, post-ish pandemic, not quite, but almost there. Here we are in the Dole Institute in the spring for our spring 2022 discussion groups. Thanks so much for being with us. I'm Audrey Coleman. I'm the director of the Dole Institute. And we got to meet our guest, our convener, our Dole Fellow for this spring, Bob Blaemire. Over the course of the pandemic, some of you might have remembered that he was a virtual guest of ours back in spring 2021, discussing his book, Birch By Making a Difference. And he was an assistant and a longtime affiliate of Senator By and his biographer as well. So if you missed that program, I encourage you to go to our YouTube channel and check it out. But it was that program that inspired our series this spring, The Giants of the Senate, and we're so pleased that Bob could be here. Senator By and Senator Dole worked closely together on the 1980 what came to be known as the Bayh-Dole Act. They worked in a bipartisan fashion, and that is the inspiration for our entire series this spring. I think you're going to really enjoy it. We'll have a few announcements and thanks before I turn it over to Bob and our guest today. This is our first installment of the spring discussion groups at 4 o'clock on Wednesdays. You'll want to come back every Wednesday at 4 o'clock, come here in person, or join us virtually on our YouTube channel. But we'd really love to see you here. Gosh, it's sure nice to be around people again. So I'm really enjoying it. And we got a pretty good house here today. Our Dole discussion groups are made possible by a grant from Newman's Own Foundation, and really exciting about this series is that we are presenting this series in partnership with several other affiliate, friend, partner institutions across the country, including the Howard Baker Center for Public Policy at the University of Tennessee, the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University, and the Frank Church Institute at Boise State University. So welcome all of you and virtual audiences of those institutions. We're so pleased you could join us. And it's so great to reach a broader audience and have your support, so thank you. Next Wednesday on February 23rd, Bob will be back with Tom Griscom, who was a former staffer of Senator Howard Baker, so you won't want to miss that conversation. At the end of today's program, we're going to take live questions from our audience here, and then also those of you who are watching virtually will be able to submit questions at an email address, dolequestions, one word, at ku.edu. Please don't be shy. Ask questions at any time, and we will be able to integrate those into our discussion after the interview. And I want to give special thanks to a couple of students, very important students without which this program could not be made possible. Will Mechnig and Raina Peter are our student discussion group coordinators this semester. They've done a fantastic job. Can we give them a round of applause, please? When you join the Student Advisory Board at the Dole Institute, you get some extraordinary experiences, and you get the opportunity for some experiences, and then you make them yourself, just like Will and Raina did. They've done a great job and are really growing, and I'm so proud of them. So great job, you guys. All right, now I'm happy to cede the floor to Bob Blaemire and his guest, the historian emeritus of the U.S. Senate, Don Ritchie. Thanks so much, gentlemen, for being with us today.
Thank you, Audrey, and welcome to the Dole Center. And whether you're online or in person, I hope also you have some questions when we get to that point of the program. And of course, as Audrey said, people online can submit their questions to dolequestions at ku.edu, and we'd be happy to do our best to entertain them. I also want to thank the Newman's Own Foundation for sponsoring this, and the three public policy institutes that have coordinated their efforts with the Dole Institute. It makes all this possible. Let me sort of first explain to you who I am and why I'm here and how this all came about, and then we'll get involved with Don. I grew up in Indiana, and when I graduated from high school, was going to George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And the day after my parents left me off, took a bus down to Capitol Hill to offer my 18 years of life experience to the junior senator from Indiana. And the reason I was interested in Birch By, the senator I'm talking about, was he had been in the plane crash with Ted Kennedy in 1964, and I was, like a lot of people of my generation, enamored with the Kennedys and the Kennedy administration, and I thought that was pretty cool that our senator was connected with that. I'd never seen a senator, much less met one or worked for one. And eventually I was able to meet him that first day. I soon started volunteering in the office and eventually got a job, and as I've joked that once I got my foot in the door, I never left. I ended up working for Senator Blaemire for 13 years, finishing with our election defeat in 1980, and he and I retained a friendship till he died in 2019. And, you know, looking back at his career, I mean, when the question came up whether or not I was a person that might write his biography, I didn't know. I thought I knew a lot about his career then. I've learned more since. And let me just give you sort of a brief summary of that career and why I felt writing a biography was a worthwhile endeavor. There have been 11,000 attempts in our history to amend the Constitution. And since the Bill of Rights, there have only been 17 successful. He has 2. Nobody since James Madison has more than 1, except for Birch Bayh. You add to that in his career as the author of Title IX, which had a remarkable impact on this country. He was the chief Senate sponsor of the Equal Rights Amendment, that while it didn't pass, the debate itself changed the country. And there was a lot of other legislation that involved women's rights, but also things like civil rights that he institutionalized, the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. And in 1980, he co-sponsored legislation with Bob Dole that has also had an incredible effect on this country. It's not very well known, but it has had its impact, and I'll give you a brief description. Birch and Dole combined their efforts in this Bayh-Dole legislation to change the way patent law worked. What was happening in this country was that the federal government was often giving money to universities, small businesses, colleges on patent development, inventions, copyrights, and so on. But the government's policy was that if federal money is in it, the federal government reserves for itself the right to bring it to market, which meant, in effect, many of these new inventions weren't being brought to market. And it just made sense to both Birch and Bob Dole that this should be changed and those rights should be given back to the colleges and universities. And since it passed in 1980, there have been more than 2,000 companies created, an enormous number of medical and in vitro devices, more than $1 trillion in generated revenue, and one company that was created under the new rules under Bayh-Dole was Google. So it has affected all of us greatly. When I first started thinking about doing this and talking to Birch about it, I had a friend who said to me, "Why would you write a biography of Birch Bayh? Nobody knows who he is." And what I thought about was people don't know who senators are. If the senator doesn't become a nominee for president, people soon forget their names. I could mention to you now the senators he served with, and most of the people here are watching probably wouldn't recognize those names. But then I was thinking, you know, history isn't just made up of the stories of presidents and emperors and kings. It's all its component parts, all the contributors. And I felt that he was a substantial contributor and his story deserved to be told. And so I entered into this process. I started doing video interviews with him, which we did over a period of 2 years. We did 30 hours of video interviews. I eventually got a contract to write the book, did other interviews with former staff, senators, congressmen, Indiana political figures. And the book came out in 2019. He was able to read the first version of it. My publication date was ironically the date of his memorial service in Indianapolis on May 1st, 2019. But because of this connection of Bayh-Dole, I got contacted by the Dole Institute about doing a book event online last March. And it really was something I enjoyed. It had a good reaction. And shortly afterwards, Bill Lacey, Audrey's predecessor, asked me if I was interested in being a fellow at the University of Kansas. And I said, sure, what's that? I've never been a fellow at a university. I've had a number of friends that say they thought I was a good fellow, and that's about as far as it got. And as we talked, and Bill gave me his idea that we do this as the giants of the Senate, not 7 weeks of me talking about Birch Bayh. I thought, wow, what the important part of that concept is that we have a whole generation of students now, many of you here today, who have no memories or awareness of a Senate that worked. that we're in a period of gridlock in our Congress, and the Senate doesn't work the way it used to work. And the Senate that I worked in and that our guest Donna is so familiar with was a Senate that did work, that played a large role in our society in doing major things that changed this country. And so essentially the idea of doing this Giants of the Senate made a lot of sense from that standpoint. And we've got a really interesting array of people that are going to be taking part. The bookends of the program, I start with the historian emeritus in the United States Senate, Don Ritchie, to my left here, and it will finish on April 6th with John Shaw, who is the director of the Public Policy Institute, the Paul Simon Policy Institute at Southern Illinois, also the author of books on President Eisenhower, Kennedy, and former Senator Richard Lugar of Indiana. And in between that, we not only have a Representative Senator Baker, next week, Tom Griscom. Senator Baker was the majority and minority leader in the Senate, later chief of staff in the Reagan White House, and later ambassador to Japan, and also married Kansas's former Senator Nancy Landon Kassebaum, who will also be one of our guests later in March. So we're delighted to have her take part. And in between, I have Sheila Burke's going to be with us, who was Bob Dole's chief of staff and very close to him, and also former staff people from Frank Church, senator from Idaho, and who was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee when my boss was in the Senate. Peter Fenn will be with me here to discuss Church and By's relationship. And then Luke Albee, who was a longtime Senate staffer of Patrick Leahy, who is a senator today and was there with Birch and Church, was there 48 years ago. So he sort of bridges the gap between the Senate the way it was and the Senate the way it is now. But I thought there could be nothing more appropriate than starting off this program with somebody who has the cosmic view of the Senate and it knows it from its historical standpoint. So the Senate established the office of the historian around the time of the bicentennial, if I got it right, like 1975, 76. Donald Ritchie, who I'll introduce here, worked for it early and became the Senate historian. There have only been 3. We're on our 3rd one now. So Don's biography is that he worked in the Senate Historical Office from 1976 to 2015. He graduated from the City College of New York, got a PhD from the University of Maryland, and served in the Marine Corps. At the Senate, he conducted an oral history program, did research and reference for senators and the media, and edited for publication such records as the previously closed hearings of Senator Joseph McCarthy. He's the author of several books on American politics and journalism, most recently, The Columnist, which I'll show you right here, Leaks, Lies, and Libel in Drew Pearson's Washington. Drew Pearson was the most famous muckraker of our generation, anyway, in the middle of the 20th century. When Don retired, Senators Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell commended his career in speeches on the Senate floor. A Capitol Hill newspaper said that it was the only time that in Congress that these two leaders had agreed with one another. So I would like to introduce Don. We've had he's not only a great historian and a good guy, but he's a great traveling companion. We traveled here from Washington together, and hopefully, given the weather, we'll be able to get back to Washington at the conclusion of this program. So let me introduce you to Donald Ritchie.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be out here. I've heard about the Dole Center, and this is my first opportunity to visit here. But there are certainly centers like this around the country, and several of them I'm watching today, and they're all based on senators that I had the opportunity to work with. Do you want to start with some questions?
Yeah, let's talk first about, pardon me, your recent book. I just started reading it, and similar to my saying people don't know who Birch Pye is, people don't know who Drew Pearson is. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Drew Pearson, then we'll get more into the Senate.
Well, if you Google Drew Pearson, you'll learn a lot more about football than you will about journalism, because there was a wide receiver for the Dallas Cowboys named Drew Pearson. But he was named for his parents' favorite newspaper columnist, and Drew Pearson had a column that appeared in 600 newspapers across the country between 1932 and his death in 1969, And then it was continued on by Jack Anderson. It was known as the Washington Merry-Go-Round. And he specialized in publishing the stories that politicians preferred not to be released. And so, of course, every time he published an accusation, the president or the senator or the prime minister would immediately call Drew Pearson a liar. He was called a liar constantly, and he was sued for libel 120 times, more than any other journalist. So my job as an historian was to take a look back and see if I could document, did he get the story right, or who was lying? And in just about every case that I came up with, Pearson got the story correct, and the politician who called him a liar was lying to cover up the situation. Even Winston Churchill, who called Pearson the most colossal liar in the United States, it wasn't because Pearson had gotten the story wrong. It's because Pearson had gotten the story absolutely correctly, and it embarrassed Churchill. So for me, as a political historian, and as someone who worked for politicians, I found it very useful to find out, how reliable is the journalism, and how reliable were the stories that Pearson was doing? He was an investigative reporter, and he was a very important part of our political scene for a very long time. He ruined the day for many members of Congress. If they saw their name in his column in the morning, it was not going to be a good day.
I found it incredibly pertinent that in just this week we have this issue of Sarah Palin, former Governor Palin, suing the New York Times for libel and the case being dismissed because of the standards set by the Supreme Court on libel and public officials, and to be talking to Don about libel and Drew Pearson. But I think it's fair to say, as a historian of the Senate, your work was more with the leadership of the Senate than with the average senator.
When I went, I was very fortunate, as fresh out of graduate school with my freshly minted PhD, to be hired to work at the U.S. Senate. I was a political historian, and to be thrown into the political arena and to get to see the people that I was writing about and I'd been reading about was just fascinating. I arrived at the very end of an era when a generation that had been running the show for decades were about to retire, and a new generation was appearing. I didn't know it at the time. It was a transitional period. But I realized right away that working in the Senate Historical Office, we were not working for any individual senator. We were working for the institution. That meant all 100 senators. You learned right away that all senators are equal, but some senators are more equal than others. And the most equal senators are the majority leader and the minority leader. And so over the years, our office worked very closely with almost all of the majority leaders and minority leaders. I had a chance to work with many of them, to see what they were like, and in some cases to draft some of their remarks. If the event was non-political, if they were dedicating a statue or a painting, or they were giving a commencement address to the Senate Page School, the leaders would ask the Senate Historical Office to draft remarks. And I have to say that the greatest thrill was to sit in the audience and hear a famous politician reciting something that you wrote for them. And my favorite, I have to say, was Bob Dole. Whenever Senator Dole needed remarks, I always volunteered to write them, because you could put a joke in the speech, and Senator Dole would tell it, and he'd get a big laugh. And then he'd ad-lib something even better and funnier. And he was just wonderful. I could write the same joke for some of the other leaders, and they would read it like the Gettysburg Address. They just didn't have the same sense of humor that Senator Dole did. So he was just an absolute pleasure to work with.
And so the first two leaders, when you got there, would be Mike Mansfield and Hugh Scott.
Hugh Scott.
Mike Mansfield, senator from Montana. Hugh Scott, senator from Pennsylvania. They were the leaders when my boss was a senator, and I was working there.
Senator Mansfield was he was like a character from The Lost Horizon somehow. He didn't seem quite like the other senators. He was actually a fairly shy person. He wasn't the kind of person who wanted to be out front. He was a reluctant leader in a lot of ways. You've all probably read Master of the Senate, the book about Lyndon Johnson. And every leader of the Senate has wanted to be Lyndon Johnson. But after a while, they realize you can't really be Lyndon Johnson. It's much more feasible to be Mike Mansfield. Mike Mansfield, who accommodated all his colleagues, who was remarkably bipartisan, who was a person who was respected by everyone. Some of his best friends were Republicans, and he was the Democratic leader. He really set the mark, the high mark for leaders. And Hugh Scott doesn't get quite the same attention, but he was a wonderful cosmopolitan figure. Mike Mansfield was from Montana. He was taciturn, and he was a real Westerner. Hugh Scott was Eastern and very just a lovely person to talk to, had wonderful political stories when you had a chance to talk to him. Surprisingly, they both shared an interest in Asian history. They had both taught, Mike Mansfield taught Asian history, and Hugh Scott collected Asian art. And they were the first senators to lead a congressional delegation to China after Nixon's visit. In fact, Mansfield was really very instrumental in pushing towards that event. And I had the opportunity to do oral histories with the chief staff members who went with them on that trip. And it was a total mystery to most of the Senate staff who went there. As one of them said, if it flew or crawled or trod or whatever, we ate it while we were on this trip. And you just ate whatever was put in front of you in the process. But the fact that the majority leader and the minority leader shared this interest and they could travel together, they could work together on the floor, it showed exactly what the Senate was all about, the collegiality of the Senate. It sure had political rivalries, but in fact of the matter is people could work together, they could cut the deal. There was a much more civility in the process, I think, when I first arrived there, and I hadn't realized essentially how things were going to change over the years.
But they were also big pipe smokers, both of them.
Yes.
That's what I remember, the image of seeing them both smoking their pipes.
Smoking was allowed in the Senate until Wendell Ford retired as a senator. He was chairman of the Rules Committee and a chain smoker. And the day after he left, there was not a cigarette to be smoked, except if you walked by the senator's private offices, you could smell the cigar smoke coming out from
also
under
the committee hearings.
Yes.
And then after you had Mansfield and Scott, there was Bob Byrd of West Virginia and Howard Baker, Tennessee.
Yeah, a generational change took place. Senator, in 1976, both Senator Mansfield and Senator Scott were retiring. And so Robert C. Byrd, a very different type of person, a fascinating man who never attended college. He took a few college classes, but he never got a college degree. He really worked his way up from a very poor background in West Virginia, a lot of manual labor in his past. But he got to the Senate and convinced American University Law School to take his congressional experience as the equivalent of an undergraduate degree and let him go to law school. And so as a senator, he went to night school as a lawyer. And he persuaded President Kennedy to come and hand him his certificate, his diploma when he graduated from American University Law School. But he also studied the parliamentary procedures of the Senate. He used to take special little classes with the Senate parliamentarian, and he knew the Senate procedures inside out. And so he's a very difficult person to challenge on the floor. And unlike a lot of his colleagues who had Ivy League educations, he never stopped his education. He continued to read and to study. He loved history. It's one reason he called the historical office quite frequently, and he gave lots of historical addresses in the Senate as well. His Republican counterpart was a very different kind of person, Senator Howard Baker, a very genial person. He was interested in photography. He took wonderful pictures, and we actually produced the first book of photographs of the Senate that he could give to foreign leaders when he traveled, because he got so many of those books when he visited other countries. He clearly was not as interested in the rules of the Senate as much as Senator Byrd was, and he knew he was never going to reach that level. But when, to everyone's great surprise, in 1980, the parties flipped. For the first time, the Democrats had been running the Senate since 1954, and they'd been one-party majority all this time. And in 1980, 13 senators were unexpectedly defeated, including Senator Bayh.
I remember it well.
And President Reagan came in, defeating Jimmy Carter. The Senate was in shock of moving. Nobody, even the Republicans, hadn't anticipated that this was going to happen. And Senator Baker took a look over at Senator Byrd, and he realized, I'm going to be on the floor dealing with Senator Byrd, who knows the rules as if he wrote them himself. And in some cases, he did write some of the rules. And Senator Baker went to Senator Byrd, and he said, I'll make you a deal. I won't surprise you if you don't surprise me. And Senator Byrd said, let me think about that. And he spent a day thinking about it. He came back to Senator Baker and he said, okay, I agree. And so as a result, the two leaders never blindsided each other. It didn't mean they agreed with each other, but they didn't try to pull any fast tricks on each other. And they worked in a very gentlemanly way. There was a lot of cooperation between them. Before, when Senator Baker was the minority leader, he pitched in and helped Senator Byrd with the passage of the Panama Canal treaties. And a treaty needs a 2/3 vote, meaning it has to be bipartisan. And if it hadn't been for Senator Baker, that treaty wouldn't have passed. It didn't do Senator Baker a lot of good in terms of his presidential ambitions, but it served the country, and it certainly helped Senator Byrd considerably. I have to say, one of the things that happened in 1980 when the parties changed was that the Washington Star, a newspaper at the time, printed what they called the Senate plum list. It was like all they considered the patronage jobs in the Senate that would be replaced. And everyone in my office, including myself, was listed there. Our titles and our salaries were printed in the newspaper, much to our surprise. And we all thought, well, maybe this is the end. We thought we were a bipartisan, nonpartisan office, but maybe this is the end. And we got a telephone call that afternoon from Senator Baker's chief of staff, who said, Senator Baker wants to let you know that he considers you to be nonpartisan and he's going to make no changes in your office. And that's when we knew that Howard Baker was a true statesman. And so we enjoyed working with Senator Baker after that. And I have to say, he was the type of person you enjoyed working with. There's an interesting phenomenon that when other people get appointed to high staff positions, and there are a lot of very significant staff positions that change when the party majority changes, the first question the other staff asks is, well, who did he or she used to work for? And if they said, oh, he worked for Howard Baker, you thought, all right, this is going to be a good person that we can work with. There are some other names that would come up. You'd say, we're in a lot of trouble now. You have to watch out. So you were known by the senators that you worked for, and it helped a lot. And Senator Byrd and Senator Baker were quite a remarkable team. I have to say that they also brought television into the Senate chamber, which was greatly resisted by a lot of the old-timers in the Senate. And both of them had to be persuaded that it was the right thing to do. And they did finally come about to bringing that about. I think Senator Baker probably pushed it first, and Senator Byrd was finally persuaded. Actually, when Senator Byrd went back to West Virginia and someone mistook him for Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House, he knew that the House was getting more publicity because they were on C-SPAN and the Senate wasn't, and it was time to make the change.
Well, I mean, going back to Mansfield, the fact that he became majority leader on the heels of Lyndon Johnson. Mm-hmm. What a change. And I remember my interviews with Birch. By the way, I prefer you not talk about the 1980 election. That's a very painful memory still. Birch talked about how Mansfield, what a good leader he was. He said he was a very quiet guy, but you knew his word was his bond, that he would tell you the truth, and whether you liked to hear what he had to say or not. And he was very gentle about it, and you could rely on him. And when I would talk to Birch about who were his best friends in the Senate, again, an indication of what a different era. The first three he mentioned were Republican senators, Mark Hatfield, Bob Packwood from Oregon, and Howard Baker from Tennessee, that they got along really well. And I remember his comment about Bob Byrd as majority leader. He said, one thing we all knew about Bob Byrd is he had a long memory.
Yes.
And that's an important factor if you're going to buck the leader at any given point.
Yes. If you're interested in Senator Mansfield, by the way, he came back to the Senate in the 1990s and gave one of the leaders' lectures, a series that we were doing at that time, and it was videotaped. And if you go to the Senate website, you can watch that speech. And it's a remarkable speech. He was a man in his 90s at the time. He actually looked better than he had when he retired in his 70s. I think being away from the Senate was very healthy for him in a lot of ways. But he gave a talk that he had intended to give about how the Senate should operate, and he was going to give it on the afternoon of November 22nd, 1963. And when word came that President Kennedy had been shot, the Senate adjourned, and he did not give that speech. And so when he was invited to come back to give the leader's lecture, he delivered that speech, and it was still relevant to the way the Senate should operate. And I was there listening to it at the time, but what I was watching was the junior senators who were in the audience watching this many of them had never met Mike Mansfield, and how intensely they were watching him, and how much they were listening to his remarks, and how much his remarks were resonating to them about how the United States Senate should operate. And so I think you can still see that speech if you go to the Senate website and type in Mike Mansfield's Leader's Lecture.
And you know how the presiding officer's chair is never really occupied by the vice president, who's the president of the Senate, unless there's a tie vote coming up. But it's usually junior senators. Do you know who was in the presiding officer's chair when President Kennedy was
Ted Kennedy, yeah.
Ted Kennedy. Yeah. So following Byrd and Baker, then you had the Democratic leader was George Mitchell of Maine, and then the Republican leader was the Kansas's own Bob Dole.
Right. And that was a big transition with when Senator Dole first and then Senator Mitchell came. We'd gotten very used to working with Senator Baker and Senator Byrd, and you don't know how things are going to be with the new leadership. I have to say the first 2 years of Bob Dole's leadership was a difficult time. He essentially was taking everyone's measure. He didn't necessarily assume that you were on his side. And so you had to justify what you were doing, and there was a lot of tension that was involved in it. The second time he was majority leader was the best time I ever worked in the Senate. He was the absolute best leader, and I had the greatest time, and I was so sorry when he resigned to run for the Senate, to the presidency, because he'd been such an outstanding majority leader. The reason was a difference between the two, was that having been minority leader, he was able to take the measure of how people responded to him. When you're majority leader, you just figure everybody's kowtowing to you because you're the majority leader. When you're the minority leader, you're waiting to see if people are going to treat you equally. And if you did, in our office, we treated the minority party always equally with the majority, and especially the leaders. He knew he could trust you. So when he came back the second time around, he had taken your measure and you were okay, and you were staying there. Not everybody stayed, but you were going to stay as a result. And at one point, one of my favorite moments with Senator Dole, as I mentioned that we used to write remarks for occasions. The Senate has a bust of every vice president of the United States because they are the presiding office of the president of the Senate. And
I'm sure everybody here is aware of all those busts, right?
Well, they're not the most wonderful artwork, but they are there. And they line the outside of the chamber. There was one missing in the collection, and that was Spiro Agnew, who had resigned. And they had made a bust, but they had never dedicated it, never installed it. Agnew was old, and he was ill, and he was annoyed that he had never been in the collection. And his friends in the Senate went to Senator Dole and said, "You've got to put this statue in now." Well, Senator Dole was getting ready to run for president, and this put him in a conundrum, because they were going to dedicate the statue. Agnew and his family were going to be there, but so were the media going to be there. And if Senator Dole was too critical, he would offend Agnew and his friends. And if he was too favorable, the media might mock him in this place. So how do you come around this? And his speechwriter got in touch with us and said, "Do you have any thoughts about how to frame this in an historical way?" And so we helped out by saying that the statues were not there to honor the individuals who were represented, but to honor the office of vice president and to remind people that the vice president is the president of the Senate. And that in the 19th century, a number of vice presidents had left office under a cloud, under scandals and all sorts of reasons why they were out of office. And that didn't make any difference. They were all there, and we understood that there were differences in the 20th century as well. And then there was a line in there in which we said that the first bust was installed in 1890. And then Bob Dole, quick as a wink, said, "And Strom Thurmond told me it was a beautiful ceremony." And just brought down the house. The Agnews laughed, the press laughed, Strom Thurmond laughed, and it just changed the nature of everything in the process. Well, the next day, Senator Dole called the historical office and thanked us profusely for the speech, and then said, "I can't get you any more money, but I can get you more space. Do you need more space?" Well, it means office space is desperately needed on Capitol Hill. And by gosh, we had a new office space as a result of that speech. And so we always thank Senator Dole for that. Senator Mitchell was a very different type of person. He looked like a professor and he sounded like a professor. But I frankly, every oral history I ever did with a Republican said he was a lot tougher than any of the professors they had to deal with. He was a very good politician. He was a very shrewd man. Turned out to be an outstanding diplomat later on. And Senator Dole and Senator Mitchell had to really contend because the parties were beginning to polarize at that point. Senator Mitchell was filing a lot more cloture motions. Senator Dole realized he only needed 41 senators to stop a cloture motion. So not only were there more cloture motions, but there were more failed cloture motions. Senator Mitchell was defining a failed cloture motion as a filibuster. So he was saying the Republicans are filibustering more at this time. And this was the beginning of a trend, very small in numbers by comparison to today, but the beginning of what was going on. So the two of them had to contend with each other at that time. But Senator Mitchell also came back to give a leader's lecture later on. And that was a remarkable speech because in between his leaving the Senate and coming back to giving that speech, he had gone to Northern Ireland and negotiated a peace treaty. And he said the first thing he had to do was to get the Protestants and the Catholics to sit at the same table and listen to each other. And he had to give them plenty of time to talk. And he realized that this was the only way that this peace treaty was going to come about was if they talked it through. And it made him change his mind about the filibuster. He came back to the Senate and he said, I fought the filibuster when I was a senator, and now I recommend to you that you don't do away with it, that there is a great deal of value in being able to talk out an issue as far as possible. And it was a real turnaround at that stage, I have to say. But both of them were important leaders. They were transitional leaders. They were very shrewd and very capable leaders, but they were still able to work across the aisle. They were still the types of friendships that Bob has mentioned. It was still an institution where you could cut the deal, where you weren't going to get everything you wanted, but you were going to get a lot of what you wanted, that you were going to treat people civilly. There was the beginnings of the kind of polarized politics that we saw, but it was still a period in which there were deep friendships that cut across the lines. One of the favorite places, by the way, in the Senate was the Senate steam room in the Russell Building, the basement of the Russell Building. Apparently a pretty dingy place, but the place where the senators used to like to go and soak at and steam, and a lot of deals were cut between politicians sitting around wrapped in towels in the steam room. Yeah, George Aiken's widow, Lola Aiken, told me that someone actually brought a bottle of Grecian formula into the steam room one day. And she said within a week, all their hair was the same color. So you get a sort of sense of the community. But when the women senators started getting elected, they objected to the fact that they were not allowed into this room. And when they finally redesigned, it's now an exercise room.
Well, they didn't have their own bathroom.
No, they didn't. There was a right behind the Senate chamber was a room called Senators Only. And when women were elected to the Senate, they were told not to go in there because that was the men's room. So you had to realize that now there are two rooms there where there used to be one, and the same thing with the steam room. But it was the beginning of a change in what was going on. And those two people were two people who both had great respect from the institution, a little bit of fear and a lot of respect, I think, of those two leaders.
Well, our program is called Giants of the Senate. Who are the people that you can remember or characterize as giants during your service outside the leadership?
Yeah, there were some outstanding senators. I'd say the single most dramatic moment that I witnessed as a Senate historian was the day that the balanced budget amendment was up for debate on the Senate floor, a vote. The House of Representatives had passed an amendment to the Constitution that said that we would have to balance the budget. 2/3 of the Senate were on record as supporting this, including Senator Mark Hatfield, who was the chairman of the Appropriations Committee. And he had supported this for a while. As it came up for the vote, Senator Hatfield really read this amendment and came to have great second thoughts that it was going to put the country into a straitjacket, that it was going to make it very difficult to operate, that there were going to be emergency situations where you're going to have to get around this. It was going to cause more problems than it solved. And he came to the conclusion that he could not vote for it. And he told Senator Dole that he was willing to resign from the Senate. And so Senator Dole could pass this amendment because he would have only 99 senators, and then 2/3 would be one less. And Senator Dole said, no, I would never ask you to do that. And I was sitting in the staff gallery, which was just over the door in which the senators come in from the elevators. Senator Dole was at his desk, and I saw him turn around and I saw him stare towards us. And he had a look on his face that he knew what was coming because Senator Hatfield was coming in. And Hatfield voted no. And Hatfield understood that he was ending his political career. He was probably going to lose his chairmanship. And he did retire from the Senate right after that. And that was the only time I actually saw a senator sacrifice himself just because he thought that he had to do this, it was the right thing to do. And very ironically, right after that, the Senate was able to balance the budget. And so the fact of the matter is that the politicians can do it if they have the will to do it. They don't need a constitutional amendment to tell them to do this at the time. But that was one of those moments. And Senator Hatfield also was interested in history. You might notice, by the way, that I rank senators by how interested in history they were. And a lot of them, they're voracious readers because they spend lots of time on planes. And so after a recess, when they come back, they would often come up to me and say, have you read this and have you read that? And they would want to talk about the book. So Bob Casey of Pennsylvania had read a diary of a senator from Pennsylvania from the first Congress, William McClay, and he was just fascinated by it. Others, just had seen the movie Lincoln, and they wanted to talk about how accurate I thought that was a depiction of Congress at that time. And I'm very pleased with that. I think that it's important that senators have a sense of history. They're in an historical institution. They sit at desks that Henry Clay and Daniel Webster sat at. They speak the same language, essentially. My distinguished senior senator from the great state of such and such. They talk like 19th century senators often. And it's important for them to know how the institution functioned in the past, what the pitfalls were, and what the great accomplishments were. And they often commemorate great senators. If you go into the reception room around near the Senate chamber, there are porthole portraits of the most significant senators. John F. Kennedy, as a senator, chaired the committee to pick the first 5. And there are still some empty portholes up above. And during freshman orientation, I would often take the families of the new senators on tours of the Capitol and point that out. And sure as shooting, somebody's mother or aunt would say, they're going to be in that porthole someday up there. And I thought, that's good. That's something for senators to aspire to think about being an historical figure, and to realize that history was going to record them and what they were doing as well. So the other thing I will tell you is that every senator has a hideaway office in the Capitol. Some of them are gorgeous rooms.
They all do?
They finally have. They used to be only the most senior did.
Yeah, it took Birch a long time to get a hideaway office.
Now they have gotten every senator. Now some of them are magnificent rooms, and some of them are little closets down in the basement. But
unmarked.
Yes, no signs on any doors. It's a place they can go to get away from the cameras and relax for a little bit, get some work done. And I've been in many of them, and I will say they have one thing in common. In every hideaway office I've ever been in, there was a copy of Master of the Senate by Robert Caro about Lyndon Johnson. And I have a feeling that most of them have read it along the way.
Do they still carve their names in their desks?
They do. They open the desk drawer and they write their name inside. And some of them have to be reminded. Senator Obama, on his last day as a senator, he had a lot of other things on his mind, was marched into the chamber by his staff and signed his name in the drawer along the way.
I seem to remember learning that a Union general that came back to the Senate and crossed out Jefferson Davis's name?
Well, it's a little different than that. When the first soldiers were brought down from the north to protect the city, they'd been attacked in Baltimore when they came through. Some of them were quartered in the Senate chamber, and some of them were quartered in the House chamber because the Congress was not in session at the time. One of the soldiers found out which one was Jefferson Davis's desk, and he took his bayonet and he shoved his bayonet into the side of the desk. And the Senate doorkeeper, Isaac Bassett, came running out and said, "Stop, you were sent here to protect government property, not to destroy it." But that desk still has a small piece of mahogany that covers over where the desk is. And I can tell you, it always goes to the senior senator from Mississippi, and that senator takes great pride in taking people onto the Senate floor and showing them where that bayonet went into the desk. And it's a real reminder of how close the Senate chamber is to the historical events that were surrounding it.
So back to the question about giants. Who else jumps out at you as being a giant?
Yeah, they all in their own way. My job as a Senate historian was to work for all of them. And, even the ones I would never vote for, I tried to work as hard as possible because their voters sent them there to do the job, and I wanted them to do the job properly. And as a result, I got to see senators some senators that I, was quite surprised about. Certainly when Jesse Helms was in the Senate, he gave a lot of senators a lot of heartburn. But as Bob points out in his book, when Birch Bayh's wife became ill, one of the first calls he got was from Jesse Helms being concerned about it. Senator Biden, President Biden always used to talk about how he resented Jesse Helms. And Mike Mansfield took him aside and said, you know that Jesse Helms and his wife heard about a child with muscular dystrophy and took such sympathy on him that they adopted him. And he began to see a much more sympathetic side of someone like Jesse Helms. So, they're in their own way, they are all giants. I will say one other thing. There's Al Franken, when he was a senator, who had a great sense of humor. He was a professional humorist. Published a book just before he left the Senate called Giant of the Senate. Yeah, only a comedian would publish a book called Giant of the Senate. And I had worked with him when he was there. And I wrote him a letter after I said, it's a very good book. It says a lot about the makings of the Senate, but that the title was incorrect because I had checked historically, and he was actually the average height of the senators over time.
Don, I could do this for hours, but we've reached the point of the program where we want to open this up for questions and find out what was on your mind or people that have asked questions online.
Oh, sure.
And Raina has a microphone over there.
I was interested in how many oral histories you have done, and then as well as what were your strategies for getting them to go beyond their public relations sound bites of their career and to delve deeper?
We interviewed both senators and Senate staff, and occasionally some people who had something to do with the Senate, but didn't actually work for the Senate. I interviewed a photographer for the New York Times who was there every day for 40 years and took those famous pictures of Lyndon Johnson towering over Senator Theodore Green, who was falling back on his desk while he's getting the Johnson treatment. I can't say how many I did. I used to probably 100 over time. About 40 of my interviews are on the Senate website. You can read the full transcripts. One of my interviews is not on the website. It's a little too blue to be on the inside. It's an interview with Bobby Baker, who was the...
which I just read, by the way.
Which Politico put on their website. But he was a little too candid, perhaps, to be on the official Senate website. But it's a fascinating interview. And I talked to mostly people when they were retired. I did have some experiences of trying to interview senators while they were in office, and it didn't work because the bells kept ringing. They had to run to vote. Constituents kept coming, wanted their picture taken. We were interrupted constantly. Once they retired, then they had time on their hands, and then they were all more reflective at that point. And the other strategy I had was I always interviewed people over multiple occasions. I never limited it to there were a couple of very elderly interviews where one fellow fell asleep 3 times during the interview. So I knew that was the only interview I was going to get. But he had been a page in 1910. And I thought, how am I ever going to meet anybody who was here in 1910? But most of them were multiple interviews. The most I ever did was 20 interviews with one person, usually about 6 or 7. And I found that people got more comfortable talking to me, and as a result, they would get a little more candid as they spoke. And they also began to realize that the people and the events they were talking about were now in the past. They were not going to be embarrassing anyone. And we also promised that the interview could stay closed as long as they wanted. And many of them would begin by saying, oh, this is going to be closed for a real long time. And then we finished, they'd say, why not open this up? There's not anything in here that I'm embarrassed about or anything like that. Some of them are still closed, but many of them are on the Senate website. And they're just fascinating stories about either people who were in the Senate. I interviewed, for instance, Ted Kaufman, who spent 22 years as Joe Biden's chief of staff, and then 2 years as a senator from Delaware, filling Biden's seat when Biden went to become vice president. I asked him, what was harder, to be chief of staff or to be senator? Oh, without hesitation, he said, to be chief of staff was much harder. He said, I'd wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning worrying about things. He said, when I was a senator, I had a chief of staff to do that for me.
When Senator Biden's wife was killed, he had just been elected to the Senate. He was not yet old enough to hold office. And I remember coming in one morning, and my boss had just arrived and asked me to try to get Biden at the hospital on the phone. And it was Ted Kaufman, who I got then, and I've known him ever since. And then Birch had a conversation and then went and visited the hospital where his sons were.
That was that event appears in many of the interviews, because many of the people I interviewed were involved, including the person who went up to the hospital to swear him in the hospital room. And that shaped his career in a lot of ways. A lot of the senior senators, he has a 30-year-old, there's a lot of resentment among the older senators to the real young senators coming in. But a lot of the older senators took Biden under their wing as a result of that incident and tried very much to make him understand the institution. He did come in with a bit of a chip on his shoulder. He was a young guy who was going to change things. And they sort of explained to him how the Senate worked. And he spent 36 years there, chaired the most important committees, and he understood the Senate and how it operated. I think that's been one of his assets as president now, is being able to talk to people across the board because of his experiences in the Senate.
Hello. I was wondering what you could tell us, what you remember, or what sticks out to you about being the Senate historian in 2008 with the financial crisis and the changing Senate.
Oh, that was an interesting year. I used to give a talk about senators who ran for president, including Senator Bai.
How many were there?
There were 50 senators between 1960 and 2008 who ran for president, or at least ran for the nomination for president. And not one of them got elected. They were terrific politicians, but between John Kennedy and Barack Obama, none of them won. And I gave a talk called "Many Are Called, but Few Are Chosen," and about why the more prominent you were as a senator, the longer you served as a senator, the less likely you were to be elected president. This Henry Clay and Hillary Clinton both came up against this, that you cast votes that alienated people. They might have liked you on everything, but they remembered you voted for the Iraq War, for instance, or Henry Clay voted for the Compromise of 1850. And their record, actually, which made them a great legislator, undermined their standing as president. You know, the reason why governors are often great presidential candidates is, what's a governor's foreign policy? You know, where does a governor really stand on these really controversial issues? They conduct those things. Senators have to vote. There's no way around that, and you can't get out of. You've taken a stand on every controversial issue there is. And so in 2008, I was able to say authoritatively that a senator was going to be elected that year. And that happened to be because both parties elected or nominated senators to run against each other. Senator McCain and Senator Barack Obama. And they were interesting. If you sat in the gallery and with the general public, and senators came and went, most people couldn't recognize anybody on the floor. But if Barack Obama came in, or if John McCain came in, or if Hillary Clinton came in, or if Ted Kennedy came in, there would be a buzz through the gallery. Everybody knew them. And there are certain senators who had risen to that. Barack Obama rose faster than anybody else. It was just astonishing. I actually published a book on the Constitution for students called Our Constitution. I published it in 2004. And we used an illustration of the Illinois Senate candidate who was running with a very unusual name, which was Barack Obama. And I have a picture of him as a candidate. I couldn't possibly have imagined that 4 years later he was going to be elected president of the United States. But he had a real magnetism to him. And one day I got to park in the garage underneath the Hart Building. And one day as I was arriving to the door, Senator Obama was coming towards me. And we both went into the door. I, of course, deferred to him as a senator. He did not have to go through the magnetometer, I guess it is. They trusted him as a senator. I had to go through it. So he walked around it and walked down the hall. And I walked behind him. And I looked down this long corridor. And as he walked through, he had the longest, skinniest legs as he came through the hallway. Every head in that hall turned around. He captured people's attention. And he had that ability. Senator McCain did as well. I have to say that Senator McCain was one of my favorites. You talk about giants in the Senate. Senator McCain was a maverick. And the Senate is a great place for mavericks because sometimes he was with his party and sometimes he wasn't. You couldn't count him in. He was a terrific fighter. He had very high standards and he held other people up to it. And he was often able to bring people together to work out an arrangement. There was one point when they were first considering the nuclear option, and it was really bringing a lot of tension into the Senate. This is about 10 years before they actually did it. Senator McCain brought all of the senators, 98 of them actually went to it, to a closed-door meeting in the old Senate chamber to talk it through, and they came out with a compromise. And he had that ability to do that. So those are the moments when you watch senators at work and you thought what they could do with this job. And to go back to the fact that so many of them didn't get to be president, sometimes when they came back after losing a nomination or losing an election, they thought, being a senator is a pretty important thing anyhow. And they threw themselves into being a senator, and they were great senators. Hubert Humphrey did that when he came back after being defeated. Ted Kennedy was a far better senator after 1980 than he'd been before 1980, and actually was one of the most productive senators after he stopped running for president. And that was true. George McGovern came back. McGovern and Bob Dole worked out great deals together. There were these moments when they realized that the U.S. Senate is a very powerful institution in itself. You don't always have to be President of the United States to get things done. And the best quote I ever heard was President Kennedy, who'd served for, I think, 14 or 16 years in the House and the Senate. He said, when I was a member of Congress, I never knew how powerful Congress was. But now that I'm president, I do. And that meant, because as a member of Congress, he's one of 535, and you never felt that you were powerful. The president seemed to have all the power. When you were president, you realized what you could do was what you could get through Congress. And there was much that he was unable to do that frustrated him in his presidency. And
the era that when we were both there is really kind of the time that senators became celebrities, which they'd never been prior to that. I mean, Lyndon Johnson could walk down the street in the 50s and no one would recognize him. And for me, when I arrived at age 18, to see Bobby and Ted Kennedy, for instance, was cool. Barry Goldwater, the people that you knew from television,
just
all of a
walking
sudden
down the
politics
street.
was televised.
One day I had a scholar from Ireland visiting, and I was taking him around. We were walking by the Russell Senate Office Building, and as we were going up the street, Hillary Clinton was coming down the street talking on a cell phone, and there was one man walking behind her. She wasn't still at the White House. She'd started out as a senator coming from the White House every day, but this was a little bit after that. And so I said, as we passed, I said to this Irish professor that's Senator Clinton. And he stopped and he turned and he said, "That's the Hillary?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Where's her security guard?" And I said, "You see that one man behind her with the earpiece? That's a Secret Service agent." He said, "In Ireland, she'd have a dozen men with submachine guns walking around."
That's only because she was First Lady.
Yes,
That's not,
exactly.
senators don't have
senators
security.
don't have that at all, yes.
Yeah, the biggest celebrity for me in that period was when John Warner was married to Elizabeth Taylor.
Yes.
And I remember taking some friends around and seeing Elizabeth Taylor. That was,
That whenever Elizabeth Taylor came to sit in the gallery, the word would pass through the Senate. And everyone would say, "I'm going down for coffee now." And of course, they'd all go down and sit in the gallery. I did see her once. It was the day that the hostages came back from seeing down at the White House. President Reagan had all the Iran hostages, and he invited the entire Senate, maybe the House as well, to go down for the event. And I was taking someone, again, on a tour. I took a lot of people on tours. We were coming out the main entrance of the Senate when 3 buses pulled up, and with all the senators and their spouses. And the first person off the first bus was Elizabeth Taylor. And I turned to the person I was taking on the tour, and I said, "I always arrange my tours to end this way." But yes, being married to Elizabeth Taylor got John Warner elected. And having a celebrity spouse and anything like that, or being a celebrity, is a big point, because the biggest thing about running for office is getting the voters to pay attention to you, figuring out who your name is, and noticing who you are in the process. And that doesn't hurt. Certainly in a lot of cases, getting celebrities to come to campaign with you is a big deal as well. But having Elizabeth Taylor at all of your rallies got John Warner, and John Warner became a very good senator. Chairman of the Armed Services Committee, and he also did a very long oral history for the Senate Oral History Office, Historical Office. But he was a much more bipartisan senator than many of the people who have succeeded him, unfortunately. And he was a genial person, and he proved after his divorce that he could get elected to the Senate without Elizabeth Taylor on the platform with him each time.
Do you have other questions?
Are there any individuals that you found had a surprising view of their career and their work after they'd retired as opposed to when they had been in office?
Yeah, that's a very good question. They did look back on the time periods, and they knew that things had changed a lot. The individual stories were just so fascinating. I spent a lot of time talking to people about their backstory before they came to the Senate, before they ran. And one of the people that I interviewed was the man who took Barack Obama's seat in the Senate. And you remember that was a very controversial piece. The governor of the state went to jail because he was perceived as selling that Senate seat. And Roland Burris was appointed, so he came in under a cloud. And I wanted to interview him because, you know, there was so much circulating around that. I thought he should be able to tell his side of the story. And he gave me the most fascinating talk about African-American politics in Chicago. A really inside account of that. And I went back to the Chicago Tribune, and I couldn't find any of the stories he was telling me. And then I realized that Chicago also had an African-American newspaper, The Defender. I went back to that. It's on ProQuest, thank goodness. And everything that Roland Burris had talked about, there was some reference to it. So the Chicago Tribune, the big main newspaper, wasn't paying any attention to the black community. But there was a black newspaper, and that steers you into where do you research and how do you study what's going on. But again, this man had a much more interesting backstory and a very fascinating story about how he was establishing himself as a senator against a lot of the resentment and suspicion when he came in at the time. I talked to a fascinating woman very early in my career, a woman named Ruth Watt, who was the chief clerk of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. They're the ones that investigate everything. She started to work there in 1947. She retired in 1979. She was the chief clerk of the committee when Joe McCarthy was the chairman. She was the chief clerk when Bobby Kennedy was a staff member on that committee. And she'd been through all sorts of events. And I just got terrific insights into how could you work for all these different people. She actually liked Joe McCarthy. She said he was the only senator who ever gave her a Christmas present, a big round of Wisconsin cheese. But she said, when they turned the television cameras on, he just lost it. He was a different person. And so it's lots of insights like that. But she did tell me the line that I have quoted the most is, I said, how had the Senate changed? She said, when I started to work there, I was young and the senators were old. And now she said, I'm old and the senators are young. And now I finally understand what she meant about that.
But to that point, how the Senate has changed.
Yes, and talk about leadership in there. I didn't get to talk about Senator Daschle and Senator Lott, who, again, were a terrific pair of leaders. And the way they handled the Clinton impeachment trial was just a model of how a bipartisan trial should be held, as opposed to the two Trump impeachment trials were models of how impeachment trials shouldn't be held, I felt. I really thought the Senate was at its best during handling the Clinton impeachment trial. And one of the things was they were determined to look better than the House of Representatives and to deal with it in a serious manner and to deal with it in a bipartisan manner. And Senator Lott and Senator Daschle have continued to be partners, essentially. They have formed a bipartisan commission, and they published a wonderful book together about the politics. And they continued to be close friends, despite the fact that one was a conservative Republican and one was a liberal Democrat as leaders at that time. I think after that, it became a lot harder for the leaders because the politics got so polarized that the leaders are expected to be leaders of their party. And that's prevented them, in a sense, from being leaders of the Senate. Senator Byrd used to say that the minority leader is the leader of his party, but the majority leader is the leader of the Senate. And I think that was true of Mike Mansfield, of Robert Byrd, of Howard Baker, of Bob Dole, of George Mitchell, of Trent Lott, and Tom Daschle. I don't think it's been true of the 21st century leaders. And one reason is I don't think their parties really have allowed them to raise to that level. They're great party leaders. They do what their party conferences want. They're in combat constantly. But as a result, it's really kept them from rising to that level that that standard that Mike Mansfield set many years ago. And I have to say, I respect those people. I worked with them, and I like them, but I understand they're working under very different circumstances and different pressures. I don't know how their predecessors would have been able to cope with the situation. To think about, when Mike Mansfield was the majority leader of the Senate, the most conservative senators were Democrats, and they were the chairman of the most powerful committees. And that you had to have a caucus that had these very conservative, very powerful Southern Democrats and these Northern liberal Democrats. You go over to Senator Scott, he's got a lot of conservative senators, Republicans, but he's also got Jacob Javits of New York, who's one of the most liberal senators. Mark Hatfield, Charles Percy, a lot of liberal senators. Every vote was bipartisan because the liberals in both parties voted against the conservatives in both parties, and they all negotiated for the moderates in the middle. Every vote was a bipartisan vote. A party line vote would have made a headline. Today, the party conferences vote together 90% of the time. There's very little overlap. There are very few people in the middle. Every vote is a straight party line vote. A bipartisan vote makes a headline. So if you're dealt, leaders play with the cards they're dealt after each election. If that's the hand you're dealt, it's really hard to be a bipartisan, cut-the-deal type of leader when your conference is dead set against everything that the other conference is doing at this time.
Further questions?
Cool. So one thing I was wondering is if you could talk more about, you kind of like went through the like majority and minority leaders in like the 80s. I was wondering if like what those relationships were like in like the 2010s especially, and like if they still, the majority and minority leaders still had like relationships like that or not the same.
Things have changed a lot. One of the things that changed was the Supreme Court said that you can't have restrictions on campaign financing, which has meant that senators spend a huge amount of their time, a perpetual amount of their time, it seems, raising funds. And that's put pressure on the leaders not to hold votes on Mondays and Fridays. So essentially, Congress is down to Tuesday through Thursday. A lot of senators, as a result, have not moved their families to Washington. They go back home to the home state. It used to be, back in the days of Baker and Byrd, and even of Dole and Mitchell, that everybody was living in Washington, that their kids were going to the same schools, that they went to the same baseball games on Saturday, the same dance recitals. They went to dinner with each other at night. They socialized. There are very few events that now, because their schedules are so crowded, they're out of town, their families are back in the home state, they don't get to know each other. Senator Reid, as majority leader, really tried to create sort of artificial social events to get families and senators together so they could see themselves as human beings rather than as political opponents. And there were events where they would seat people at, one of the senators told me, it was always good if you brought your spouse to an event because your spouse would seat you with people that you wouldn't have sat with yourself. And you got to know them in different ways along the way. I was telling Bob earlier that Senator Reid loved the movie Lincoln. And he had an event in which they showed the movie in an auditorium at the Capitol with a reception, invited all the senators and their spouses, and I was invited to attend. And when the movie was over, out on the stage came Steven Spielberg, Daniel Day-Lewis, Doris Kearns Goodwin, the author Tony Kushner, and the producer Kathleen Kennedy. And the senators asked questions, and it was just fascinating to see them asking questions. I will say that when Daniel Day-Lewis responded in a British accent, there was a gasp because they had just watched him for 2 hours sounding just like what they thought Abraham Lincoln should have sounded like, and they realized he was an actor and he was performing them. But the fact is that they have to do those things artificially now because there just aren't the natural events in which senators could get together. And I don't know that the senators today know their colleagues the way they used to. There are some events, there are still some nice events. Mike Enzi, who just died in Wyoming, former senator, his wife spent the month of December cooking Christmas cookies. And they would have a big Christmas cookie party and would invite people in. There were some of those things. Those things are actually pretty important to take away the tensions on the situations. As Bob was talking about with Senator Helms, when Mrs. Bai was sick, it's moments like that when they forget about politics and they remember each other in a human way. And those things are important when they do need each other politically, when they need some help in the process. And in fact, Ted Kennedy was very shrewd. He always said if his staff came to him with a good idea and he liked it, his first question was, who's my Republican on this? And he wouldn't go any further unless he had a Republican that he could do it. And it was often a very conservative Republican, someone like Orrin Hatch or Dan Quayle even on the jobs bill, or others that would never vote with him on 90% of the issues. But on health issue or on jobs issue, you could get them together. And if you could get Orrin Hatch on board, you could get conservative Republicans behind this, and then you could get liberal Democrats behind it. If it was just Ted Kennedy, the Republican side would never vote for them. And so those are the really shrewd senators who know that they've got to make those connections. And they often find out that there's something about the personal side of the senator that goes beyond their ideology, goes beyond their politics. The Americans for Disabilities Act was probably the most bipartisan bill that ever went through Congress because everybody who served in Congress had some health problem or some relative with a health problem. Someone who was deaf, someone who was blind, someone who was in a wheelchair, and they knew the hardships and the handicaps that they were up against. And they all pitched in regardless of what the issues were. And I remember at one point, one of the senators who had cancer and was dealing with this, and a bill dealing with cancer came up, and the leader of his party said to him, well, you're just voting for this because it's personal to you. And he said, of course it's personal to me. Of course it is. And it's made it important to me. And these are human beings who are thrown together in political arena to represent their states, to represent their parties, to advance their political careers, but they have a chance to shape the legislation. You have to figure out what it is that really is driving them. Some of the people I've done oral histories with were head counters. The head counters are on the floor trying to figure out how people are going to vote before the vote is taken. And they all have said to me the same thing, is you never take a vote for granted. You never assume that a senator is going to vote this way because of this or because of that, because they're automatically, because of their politics or because of their ideology. And one of the stories I always love is Roman Rushkin, who's a senator from Nebraska, was managing a bill. He never bothered to ask Barry Goldwater how he was going to vote on this bill because he knew Goldwater was conservative and he was a conservative, so of course Goldwater was going to vote with him. And he was shocked when Goldwater voted against him. And he went running over to Goldwater on the floor and he said, Barry, why didn't you vote? Why did you vote against the bill for the other bill? And Goldwater said, I had an amendment on the bill. I wasn't going to vote against the bill that I had an amendment on. Well, Rushkin never bothered to ask that. And there's a lot of personal situations that play into politics and to the individuals. And I got to know a lot of the senators as human beings, as people who were interested in history, as people who were curious about things. I will say the other thing I discovered about senators, every senator I ever met knew their state inside out. And after a recess, when they were coming back to town, hadn't seen each other for a while, you would see them talking, and they would be saying, well, what's unemployment like in your state? And the senator would be able to rattle off what the unemployment figures were, what was happening with the timber industry, what was going on with this or that. That's, of course, what kept them in office. And I think it's a good sign that the institution is doing what it's supposed to do, which is represent the state's interests. I never met a single senator who didn't know what was going on. And if they didn't, they probably weren't going to be more than a one-term senator. And there were a lot of one-term senators. Again, we've talked about this. One of my favorite lines was the Bob Dole line after 1986. In 1986, all the senators who were elected with Ronald Reagan in 1980 were up for re-election. And you remember that was a surprise election. A lot of those senators never expected to win, and they got in on Reagan's coattails. But Reagan wasn't running in 86, and a lot of them were defeated. And Senator Dole said, you know, back in 1980, if we knew we were going to win, we would have run much better candidates. That was a great line. You could always count on him for a very candid line that would get everybody to laugh.
Yeah, I quote one of his lines in my book, which I probably should not do, tell here. But in our office, we also used to, first thing Birch would ask when we were going to introduce legislation is who was our Republican co-sponsor. Right. And those dinners, the dinners with other senators and their wives were hugely important.
They had more of them in those days. And Birch was better known because his family lived in Washington, and they were part of the scene.
That's right.
And there aren't many who do
in
that.
fact, Lyndon Johnson told him when his first day when they came to Washington before they were sworn in to deal with committee assignments, Lyndon Johnson was vice president, and he asked Birch that day, he's standing there with his wife Marvella, and he says, "What are you kids doing for dinner?" And they looked at each other, and it was clear they didn't have plans. And Lyndon said, "Well, I'll call Bess and see if she can whip up some leftovers for you, and we'll take you out to dinner." And he took them in his limousine out to their home in Washington, and then he took them house hunting. And he told them when he was taking them house hunting, he said, "Buy a house when you're here. When you leave the Senate, it may be the only thing you own. Maybe your only wealth would be that house." And Birch said that was the best advice he was ever given.
I remember when Senator Trent Lott became a senator, he went to see his predecessor, that was Senator Stennis, very old
John
trusty,
Stennis,
Democrat from Mississippi. And he said, "Senator," he said, "what's the best advice you can give me as a new senator coming in?" And Stennis looked at him and said, "Buy a house, don't rent." And over the time, of course, property values had increased enormously
in Washington
D.C. I always thought, well, that was probably very practical advice that a senator should follow.
You have other questions? I think that it's funny. There's so many stories, and we could go on for hours. When I arrived there at age 18, the president pro tem of the Senate was Carl Hayden of Arizona. Part of your discussion reminded me of him. He'd been the first senator from the state of Arizona, had been sheriff of the Arizona Territory, and he was like 90-some years old when it was there. And I just remember seeing these people up close, day in, day out. Was just an amazing experience.
And just to show you how powerful Carl Hayden was, is you can play golf in Phoenix, Arizona. Now, consider that Arizona is a desert. And the fact is, unless you have water, you're not going to have green golf courses, and you're not going to have a large population. Carl Hayden, as chairman of the Appropriations Committee, diverted about 40% of the water of the Colorado River into Arizona against competition from California and from Nevada and from Colorado and other states along the way. The population of Arizona today would not be sustained if it hadn't been for the amount of water that was pumped into there. So there's not a road you can drive on in Arizona that Carl Hayden didn't have something to do with building. There's not a dam that was built that he didn't, over those 50, 60 years he was there, have something to do with it. And I always thought Arizona was such a classic state in that they constantly re-elected Carl Hayden to bring back federal money. And then the other senator was Barry Goldwater, who said, "We're rugged individualists. We don't need the federal government to be helping us all the time." Well, it was nice to have that talk there, but it sure was a lot nicer to have the appropriations funds that were coming into their state. And if you look at who have been chairman of the Appropriations Committee, they have rarely been senators from big states like New York or California. They've usually been senators from small population states like Arizona or West Virginia. Arkansas. And quite frankly, if you go back to West Virginia, pretty much every road that you're going to drive on, especially any east-west road, was built through money that Robert C. Byrd brought into that state. There were only north-south roads really going through West Virginia before that, and he realized that you had to build roads over the mountains to be able to open the state up in a lot of ways.
Yeah, we used to joke about Bob Byrd paved West Virginia.
Yeah. And he did put his name on most of them, so you do drive down there, but he reminded his constituents what he was doing, and that's part of the bringing home the bacon is part of that. And certainly Ted Stevens did the same in Alaska, and just in general, that is an important part. And Senator Bai was very happy to get onto the Appropriations Committee.
Oh, absolutely.
When Fritz Hollings came to the Senate, he wanted to get on the Armed Services Committee. And he went to talk to Richard Russell, who was the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. And Russell said, you don't really want to be on the Armed Services Committee. You want to be on the Appropriations Committee. That's where things happen. You know, the authorizing committees, they write the bills, but there's nothing in those bills unless you appropriate the money to pay for them. And that's where the real deals happen. If you sit in the Senate chamber during a vote, and they're all pouring in from all the doors, and they vote, and then they're still there, they talk, they call it a cocktail party without cocktails, when they're all chatting with each other. You'll see little knots of senators. And quite often there's a member of the Appropriations Committee in that knot, and you'll see them writing things down. That's because the senators are saying, you know, we're really trying to get that highway through, or we're really trying to get this through, or we're really trying to get that through. It's become less, they've been less capable of doing that under the current polarized system. But one of the big bills that passed the Congress, in this last Congress, that was totally bipartisan, was the infrastructure bill, because that brought projects back into every state and every district, and everybody had a share in that. And so that was an interesting bill that people voted across ideological lines to get that bill through. And that was a throwback to the old days when the Senate and the House were a lot more cooperative.
Well, my prejudices about my favorite senator were made clear. Do you have a favorite senator?
You know, I've sort of steered away from having favorite senators because they were all my favorite senators for a time. There were some senators I just loved to go to listen to talk. They were just fascinating people. Senator Moynihan could give the most fascinating speeches along the way. And, you know, you could sit there and listen for hours to him speaking. And he sometimes would take those hours to speak.
Everett Dirksen,
Right,
Evs up.
Well, I didn't hear
Evs
Everett
up.
Dirksen in person. I saw him in the Senate, but that was before my time there along the way. But there were a number of them that I went to, but I would always apologize to my guests when I took them into the gallery. I'd say, you know, you're not going to hear Daniel Webster today. We're not going to hear a great oratory. There's probably going to be somebody standing up reading a speech to an empty chamber. And then every once in a while, to my surprise, a debate would break out. And it would remind me how skillful these people were, that to get elected, you can get elected by accident. It's almost impossible to get reelected by accident. There are just some terrific people in the Senate who know what they're talking about. And I remember one time I had a group of Germans who I was taking through the Capitol, and Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois and Senator Judd Gregg of New Hampshire, again, a very liberal senator and a very conservative senator, they were debating bankruptcy legislation. Now, how dull could a subject be than bankruptcy legislation? Well, these two were sharp-witted, they knew what they were talking about, and they were zinging back and forth across the chamber. And my German guests, it was like a tennis match. They were going back, but I couldn't get them out of the gallery to go to the next stop because they were so fascinated with that debate. Well, they're capable of doing that. They just don't get the opportunities to do that that they have in the past. And as a result, as I said, I worked for every single senator, and to some degree I came to respect all of them. But again, I began this by saying all senators are equal. Some senators were a lot more equal than others.
But I also remember the line that Harry Truman had when he got elected to the Senate. He said, I stood there on the floor of the Senate and said, how did I get here among all these great men? 6 months later, I was asking, how did they get here?
You're right.
I think we have reached the conclusion of our program, folks. I'm delighted that you showed up. Again, let us thank the Newman's Own Foundation and the Baker Church, Simon Institutes for cooperating and sponsoring this program. Delighted you showed up. I hope you show up for more of our sessions. People online, I hope you also tune in for our sessions. I look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you, Don, for joining us. Good evening.
Oh, thank you.